I'm happy to be stopped. So don't be shy. I don't want you interrupted, so please make sure you don't get confused, okay? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started then. So before we get to this week's material, I want to talk a little bit, kind of briefly, about last week. And I'll try to do this, usually give you a little kind of review at the beginning of every lecture to help you kind of get back into the flow of the class. I know you have lots of classes. Don't get to be reminded. So last week I emphasized the idea of the usable versions of history, right? And this was an idea that I said acknowledges things like the fact that our own experience and knowledge shape the kind of history that we do and the kinds of stories that we tell. Right? The story that you're going to tell is going to be different from the story that your classmates are going to tell. The way you're going to understand any historical object is going to be different from the way that your classmates are going to understand these objects. Right? This idea of useful history, or usable versions of history, also insists that knowledge about the past has some value in the present. Okay? Very simple. Things we learn about the past can help us work through problems in the present. And I just want to draw your attention to a couple of ways of thinking about this idea of useful history from the films we watched last week. Okay? It's easy for me to say those things, but let me give you some concrete examples to help you think about what that means. So let's take the first one we watched last week first, Night and Fog. There are a whole series of ways that this film might be understood as a kind of useful history. First, and perhaps foremost, to make the film, right, René, the director, and his assistants relied upon historical footage pulled from archives and then reassembled to construct a narrative. Now that footage that he relied upon, right, that history, it could have been used to tell any kind of story, right? It didn't have to be this kind of story. Right? Those of you who are fans of the fake movie trailers, right? Do you know these fake movie trailers? Where people recut a trailer with like a different soundtrack and different voiceover, whatever. It's the same kind of idea, right? You could take the same trailer. The Shining, I think, is the one that's really famous, right? If you haven't seen this, find the fake trailer for The Shining on YouTube. Right? It's the same idea. You could take that trailer, add a different soundtrack, and it would be a totally different trailer, right? My point here is that René could have done something similar. You could take all that same footage, you could tell a really different kind of story. Does that make René's story any less true or accurate or interesting? No, it just means that you could tell a different kind of story, right? You could use that history that he used to make a different story, right? To tell a different history. Now, the second thing we want to think about is how film might have been useful to audiences at the time. Right? And this is something I'm going to encourage you to do over and over again in this class. Try to put yourself in the mind of someone in the past. Right? And this week, as you'll see, I think it's going to be particularly important to try to break yourself out of the present and go back and think, well, what would somebody back then have thought about this? Not so much what I think about it right now. Right? So if we think about Night and Fog, the victims, and the families of the victims of the Holocaust might have used this film in one way, right, or many different kinds of ways. Those who wanted to prove that the Holocaust had happened, right, against those who said it hadn't, would have used it in perhaps a very different way. And for those who wanted, for instance, and here, right, this image, you'll remember, I emphasize, for those who wanted to demonstrate that the French state, in particular, had been complicit in the deportation of French citizens to the camps, right, the film might be useful in a very different way, and the French state didn't want that to happen, so they tried to censor the film and make it tell a different kind of story, right, by transforming the history that René was using, right, to make it less useful, you might say. Now, finally, we would want to ask how the film's usefulness has changed for audiences over the last 61 years since it was made. For us in this class, this film, this history, is useful for learning about things like how French cinema developed after the war, and the kinds of problems, both political and formal or aesthetic, the kinds of problems that interested filmmakers in the 1950s. Right? That's how we're using this film. And you might use it in some other ways to tell your friends, your family, something about the French past. Now, I won't say too much about Hiroshima Mon Amour because we do have to move on to the new stuff, but you could ask similar kinds of questions about that film and about its changing useful usefulness, its changing meaning, and how, for instance, French audiences at the end of the 1950s might have used this film to help them make sense of things like the atomic bomb, right? Or the French treatment of women during and after the war, as is animated in part in this film, okay? So those are just some ways to think about what I mean when I keep harping on this idea of usable versions of history. We'll come back to it more than a few times. Okay, now, for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be thinking about how cinema was formed as a medium. Right? We're going to be thinking about its invention, its formal development, and the social and political questions, the social and political developments that surrounded the development of this artistic form. And we need to establish 2 framing questions for this week that I want to set up now. The first is, and they're here at the bottom of the slide, the first is, well, what is a medium? Right? When I say making a medium, what do we mean by that? And then second, how do we study the creation and development of a medium? Like, what's the right way to ask about how a medium was created? These are 2 very broad questions. Now, briefly for now, the word medium, it means most basically a means of doing something, or most commonly of communicating something. Okay? You've probably heard this word in this way, very straightforward. Film, in this sense, is a way of communicating, right? Of expressing thoughts and ideas. So we'll be asking in the next few weeks, how did film come to express thoughts and ideas, to communicate? How did it become, by extension, an entertaining form of communication? And what kinds of ideas did it come to express? We should not, however, take for granted that film was a form of communication. I'm going to emphasize that film didn't have to be made to communicate things. It could have come to do lots of other things. Right? The word medium would suggest that it's about communicating something, and that is indeed, of course, one thing that film did. Now, second, we should also keep in mind a second part of the definition of medium. A medium also implies the substance or the physical form through which something is conveyed. So here you might think of the definition of a medium as a person who communicates with ghosts. Right? We call these people mediums. This is a person who becomes the living substance, a physical embodiment that provides a way to reach the dead, right? An immaterial thing, or he or she, this medium, can give those immaterial spirits the physical substance through which to communicate. Right? And more generally, when we think of a medium, or its plural, media, or its verb, mediate, right? Medium, media, mediate, right? All these forms, we're thinking about some physical form that provides a means to transmit information. Okay? Now, why do I emphasize this second part about the physicality, the physical form of the medium? Well, I do this because the physical nature of a medium reminds us that a medium isn't just about the ideas that it communicates. Right? In other words, film isn't just about the content that we see when we watch it. Right? Studying this class isn't just the images on the screen. It's also about everything we need to make that content and its transmission possible. Right? To study a medium is to study the technologies that make its forms of communication possible, and also to study the social and cultural contexts that then shape those technologies. Okay, so we have to study essentially a history of film technology if we want to make sense of the ideas that it communicates as a medium. So the word medium then provides us with, I think, an expanded enough view of what film is to allow us to really understand how it developed, all of which I think will make more sense in just a moment. So this week we're going to focus on the invention of this film medium. We're going to ask where it could come from, what did it take to create film, why did it emerge when it did, and not before that or later than that, and what kinds of things shaped what film became and then how it worked. I'm going to try to make some sense of where this thing came from. Now, there are 3 really big takeaway points for this week. Right? 3 things. If you don't learn anything else this week, there are 3 things. Right? And here's a good moment for me to remind you that you don't have to take down every single bit of text on the slides. I won't give you really text-heavy slides, but you don't have to type them all down because you can go on the course Blackboard page and you will be able to download these slides in PDF form usually, and they're currently there. So if you want to download these slides, they're waiting for you. Okay. So the three big takeaway points that I want to make sure that you know. The first is a point about technology, right, that physicality of the medium, and it's a relatively straightforward one, which is that technology does not drive history. Maybe it's not so straightforward, actually. Technology does not drive history. What do I mean by this? What I mean is technological development has been, of course, critical to film's development as a medium, but technology does not develop consistently towards some preordained form. Rather, technologies are shaped by social, cultural, economic forces that help determine what form they take. And I'm going to explain more about what I mean by this soon. In other words, film did not have to become the sound, color, large screen, darkened theater experience that we tend to think of, or that people thought of for a long time when they thought of, well, what is film? Right? It means something that you go to see in a movie theater that's in color and sound, right? That didn't have to happen. Okay? And in fact, we're going to see that film could have become lots of things, and it still is many things. A fact that is especially clear today in the era of new digital technologies and viewing platforms that really are challenging all those old theatrical norms, things that people, say 20, 30 years ago took for granted as what film was. Right? Film meant that you went to the movies and watched these things. Well, these days, you might think that film is something you watch on your phone and has nothing to do with movie theaters, or it might mean something else. We're going to return to this point about technology at various moments in the course, especially the beginning of next semester, when we talk about sound. Okay, so that's point one. Technology does not drive history. Right? Technologies are shaped by social and other kinds of factors. The second is a corollary point, and that is that the first films, what we call early cinema, okay, the very first films, when I say early cinema, we're talking about before 1907, effectively what we're going to be looking at this week. These films were not primitive. Were not primitive films. Early films should not be seen as the subpar precursors to feature film. In other words, they were not some kind of primitive form that was just waiting for full development. Okay? It would be easy for us to watch these films this week and be like, oh, look how they didn't know what they were doing. So eventually they would later learn what a film was really supposed to be like. I wonder why it took them so long. Right? We should not think about these films in this way. Right? Rather, what I want you to see is that early films were the product of really distinct aesthetic strategies, and that they were experienced, enjoyed, and celebrated as real achievements on their own. Right? No one who watched early films in 1895 said to themselves, I really wish that this film was an hour and a half in color, with sound, and that it told a long narrative story, maybe a love story. Right? No one thought that. Okay? That didn't happen, right? People watched these films and they thought, that's amazing. Like, I can't believe that they're able to do this. What a great artist, what a great, well, they did not think it was art, we'll get to that, right? But what a great entertainment form, right? Or what a great form of science, right? What a great way of learning about the world, right? People thought films were really great already in 1895. Right? So we should try to understand these films as they were understood then, and not as we think of film now, right? And one way to do this is through the concepts that we're going to study this week of the cinema of attractions. Okay? We'll talk more about the cinema of attractions quite a bit later today or tomorrow. And then finally, the third kind of takeaway for today, for this week, is that cinema was always a global art. Okay? We're going to say less about this week, but pay attention to how film developed simultaneously in lots of different contexts. Okay? Film was not born as French art or American art, although we will emphasize the contributions of French and American inventors and other filmmakers and business people. But in fact, film was never just one national thing. It was always a global art form. It was always moving across borders. The people who made these films were always moving around the world and collecting ideas from different places. And we want to just keep that in mind. We want to think about how interactions between these different kinds of contexts helped to shape what cinema became from the very beginning. Okay? So those are the three big points. So let's start then to work through this in more specific detail with the story of pre-cinema and what I'm going to call the tenacious resistance of matter, which is a quote from André Bazin. We'll get to in a second. So cinema starts, one might say, on December 28, 1895. What happened on December 28, 1895? Anybody? Right. Exactly. December 28, 1895 is the day of the first time an audience paid to go and watch a public screening of film. Okay? So we tend to think of that as the invention moment, right? The beginning of cinema. In fact, as you'll see, we could date the beginning somewhere else, but that's the time that we tend to think of. And just to give you a sense, here's what happened. December 28, 1895. People paid to watch that, among other things. Right? There were other films, it wasn't just that. They watched it in a place that looked something like this. This is a recreation of the Grand Café. Right? The Grand Café was in the basement of, this was the basement screening of the Salon Indien, in the basement of the Grand Café, which is in central Paris. And this is where the first screening took place. This was a recreation of what that space might have looked like from an exhibition about the Lumiere brothers, with the inventors of the device that was used to show the films that night. This is from an exhibition that took place in Paris 2 years ago now. So on that night, the Lumiere brothers showed their invention. The Lumiere brothers were from a family of photographers. They had a photographic plate-making factory in Lyon. And there in Lyon, they had also been experimenting with trying to turn these still images into moving images. They had developed a device that I'll say more about in a moment called the cinematograph. And on this evening, they used that device to project these images to a paying audience to great acclaim. Okay. Now, what needed to happen to make this possible? This is the question I want to ask, right? If this is the invention moment, right? If this is when cinema begins, well, actually lots of things had to happen for that to take place, right? They needed this device, they needed to be able to show things, they needed people to care in the first place, they would want to come and watch this, right? Like, why would you want to go and see this? So what kinds of things happened? Now, to answer, I want to start with what might seem like a rather odd claim by the French film critic, theorist, and co-founder of Cahiers du Cinéma, the still existent film magazine, André Bazin. So in 1946, in an article that you're reading this week in your course reader, an article called The Myth of Total Cinema, Bazin writes that cinema has yet to be invented. Okay? And this is in 1946. Okay? Cinema has not yet been invented. Here we are in 1946. Okay? Now, Bazin's point was not, of course, that there was no such thing as cinema. Right? There was, no doubt, in 1946, cinema. It was rather because it had yet to fulfill a mythical idea, what he called a mythical idea. Now, a mythical ideal. Most obviously because films were still made in black and white. Okay? They were sound. They're still in black and white, so they hadn't yet fulfilled this idea that film might become a perfect reproduction of reality. Now, Bazin argued that the myth of cinema had existed long before what we think of as cinema, before it was invented. Long before, that is, 1895. Right? Before December 28, 1895, Bazin says the myth of cinema already had existed for a long time, and it existed in the minds of scientists, inventors, and tinkerers who developed a whole variety of devices that prefigured cinema's reproduction of life in motion. So what took so long to develop cinema then? Right? This is the question, in part, that he's asking. Like, well, what took so long? If all these people already had this idea of cinema in 1895, before 1895, why was it only in 1895 that it was developed? And Bazin argued that the reason was because of what he called the tenacious resistance of matter. And the tenacious resistance of matter is what he calls this here. In other words, simply, the technologies did not exist that would allow for movement to be recorded, reproduced, and projected. What technologies? What technologies did not exist? These included things like photography, like photograph, dry emulsion, part of the photographic technology you needed, a flexible base, right? That stuff, film, that the medium takes its name from, that stuff didn't exist. A mechanism to feed that base, right, through a device to project it on a screen. You need a lens, you need a light bulb, right? You need all these different devices, and you need it to get it onto a large screen. Now, where did these technologies come from? More importantly, what motivated their creation? Bazin rightly argues that focusing on technologies offers a relatively poor account of cinema's discovery. This is his way, in a sense, of making one of our key points for this week, that technology does not drive history. In other words, that technologies didn't create the idea of cinema. Rather, the idea of cinema awaited and helped shape the technologies that made it possible. So in other words, people already had an idea of cinema before the machines existed that made cinema. Right? You had to have this idea in order to create these machines in the first place. So it wasn't that the technologies defined what cinema was. It was the idea of cinema that defined what the technologies were that made it possible. Now let's look at some of these devices that preceded cinema and helped make it possible, while trying to pay some attention to what motivated their creation. Now I'm going to run through a whole bunch of devices, and you should try to know what some of these are. These kinds of things make for good identification things on tests. Okay? So pay attention to what some of these things are. Okay? So the first device that we want to talk about is something called the thaumatrope. Okay? The thaumatrope, which is a kind of hybrid, and we're going to see that all these devices have these weird scientific amalgam names, right, to tell you something about what they were about. Right? So the thaumatrope is a combination of two words, thauma, marble, and tropos, turning. Right? It was developed by a guy named John Paris in 1824, and Paris was a British physician. Okay? And he designed it, and this is how it worked. You've seen these in movies or maybe in other places, right? You have a disc, you have an image on one side, you have a different image on the other side. If you spin the disc, you tie it to a string, spin the string, the disc will go around, and the two images will appear as if they're one image. Right? If you've ever seen Tim Burton's movie Sleepy Hollow, one of these devices appears very prominently in that film. Make one of these at home tonight for fun. Now, why did Paris develop this thing? Like, who cares? Why would he do this? Well, he did it to demonstrate the idea of the persistence of vision. The idea that images remain for a brief instant on your retina, and that movement is created by the overlap between these images. All right, so you see one thing, and for a very tiny instant, it stays there while your eye sees the next thing. Right? And this is why you see movement, right? Because there are always two images in your eye at the same time. Right? This was the idea that these scientists had. We now know that's probably not actually how your eye works, right? But this is the idea they had, and he wanted to test it in this way, by taking literally two images and trying to see if you could move rapidly between them, and if the one image together would be visible in your eye. Okay. Similar device created for some way similar reasons, is developed by a Belgian physicist, right, another scientist, Joseph Plateau, who later, it might be noted, went blind from staring at the sun. Right, so his interest in the workings of the eye went too far. And he developed this device called the phenakistoscope. Again, composed of two words, one meaning deceive, and the other look at. Right? So here we have some sense of his idea that this was about a kind of deception of what we see, the deception of reality. And this one became really important, in part because Muybridge would use it, and Muybridge as a photographer is very important. We'll talk about him in a moment. But the idea of this one is that you could spin this disc, which would have slightly different images, right? And when it spun, it would look like, right, as you see, right, these figures are moving. Here's another image of it. You could mount the disc, it has little slits. You could hold it up to a mirror, and then you could spin it, and you could see through the slits. You could see what appeared to be the figures moving. These are really popular as animated GIFs now. If you search for these on the internet, you'll find lots of these. They're really amazing. Similar device, another similar device, they all tend to involve some kind of rotation, right, movement. It's called the zoetrope. Right? The zoetrope, developed by William Horner, who's a British mathematician, right? Another person in the STEM fields. Right? Zoetrope is a word, mixture of life and turning, right? Again, turning creates life here. And again, it was about using different images. And I think I might have a little video to show you an example of what this might look like. You can buy these things in novelty stores. Film museums will often have them. It's not that different from the thaumatrope, it's just more images that create a much more developed pattern of movement. Essentially by scientists who are interested in how the eye worked, right? You might say the invention of cinema is a product of science, not entertainment, right? Not culture, not art. Scientists developed cinema because they wanted to understand how our eyes work, okay? It turned out that understanding how the eyes work has entertainment value, right? And we get cinema. Okay, so the idea of being able to create motion out of stillness is one thing that you need to make cinema, and scientists work on that. Another thing that you need is a way to put that motion onto a screen. And this develops, you might say, kind of in parallel with the efforts to make motion. One of the main inventions that really matters here is something called the magic lantern. And one of the arguments that some film historians have developed sort of recently, say in the last 10 years or so, and we'll talk about one of them this week, is that in fact, really we should all be writing the history of the magic lantern, not the history of cinema. Right? That the magic lantern is the technology that really mattered, not film. Right? And in fact, film is just a subset of the magic lantern. Okay? We're not going to debate this argument in this class, but just so you know, people still debate these things, and they really care. Now, the magic lantern was developed independently by lots of people around the same time, probably in the mid-17th century, maybe earlier in China. The people we know for sure are a series of Dutch, German, and Italian scholars. Some of their names are here. And they developed this device to be able to project glass slides on the screens, often for educational purposes. Right? They wanted to be able to teach people things, be able to project things on screens, as we've learned, we still do this, right, is a good way to teach people things. And the magic lantern was one way to do this. And essentially it involved a lens, right, the same way the film works. Lens, light comes through the back, put a semi-transparent slide in front, and that image is projected projected onto a screen. By the end of the 19th century, by the end of the 1800s, these things have developed into mass manufactured commodities, right? And lots of people own and use magic lanterns. Sometimes they're used at home for entertainment, right? Hey kids, let's get out the magic lantern and look at some slides together, right? Or they were used in churches, right, to illustrate the gospel, or they were used in schools for educational purposes, as I said. These devices needed materials, right, and there are lots, you can find a lot of this stuff on the internet now. There are lots of different kinds of slides that were used, and they became very elaborate, right? Initially you might just have a single image, but eventually you get slides that can do things like this. You can see that, yeah. You could create motion with the slides by, often the projectors would sometimes have multiple lenses, so you could overlap 2 or 3 images at a time. The slides could be moved and slightly manipulated, so that you could create motion like this right here, or you might have one slide that's the ship, one slide that's the background, like the sky, and then another slide that makes these waves. And you can manipulate that slide to create the sensation of movement. Okay. So here we have the kind of intersection of the desire to try to create motion from stillness and also to project it onto a screen. Okay. You get a kind of further development of this in something called phantasmagoria, which is essentially like a spectacle show, often with ghosts, where you would have magic lanterns projecting slides of sometimes dead people. Robespierre was a really popular one. And they would project from behind curtains, right? And sometimes onto other kinds of things in a space, a theatrical space. And you would do these performance shows. Again, there would be movement involved because you could mount the magic lantern onto a cart and you could push it. You could make the image get bigger and smaller. You get the sensation that a ghost is wandered into the theater. Right? So this is a further development. Okay, and then finally, well, maybe not finally, but then you get a kind of more elaborate, you might say, version of this, which is something called the théâtre critique. And the French like to argue that this guy, Émile Reynaud, is in fact the inventor of cinema, and what Reynaud did was he developed a projection system, and I'll play you a video that shows you how it works in animated form while I describe it. And what Reynaud did, he was an animator, effectively, and he here's his device. Reynaud really painstakingly essentially did what animators do. He did image by image to create long stories. These could be really long, right? 30 plus minute range. And he developed this elaborate system of lenses and lights to be able to project these images and reflect them onto a screen. It was a painstaking operation. He didn't make very many of these théâtre optique films because it took so long, it was so costly. But this is an early effort to try to create the sensation of motion projected onto a screen, right? In a more fluid manner than you could get with a magic lantern slide, where at best you could probably make the single image move a little bit, and then you can move to the next image and make it do that too, and you can tell a story. Right? But here you can tell a very fluid, long story, moving figures, moving objects on the screen. Okay, now, the next part that you need, right, so say you can create motion, stillness, you can get it onto a screen. Well, cinema, of course, we know, tends to be images of reality, right, photographic images. So you can't have that without the development of photography, which emerges in approximately the 1830s. This is not a class about the history of photography. I'll give you the short version. We have 2 principal figures that really matter here. One is a Frenchman, Louis-Jacques Daguerre, who developed one kind of photography in the 1830s. This is a kind of photography that is not so good for making movies because it relies upon copper plates. Right? The images are developed on hard physical substance, physical objects. Right? You can only, every image is unique, in the daguerreotype, which is what he called his photography. So you can't reproduce, right, lots of images, and it's hard to run copper plates through a film projector. Okay? So Daguerre figures out one way. About the same time, a guy in England called Henry Fox Talbot develops a more useful, you might say, kind for cinema, which is a kind of photography that involves paper. Right? He prints his images are printed onto paper. Okay? So by the 1840s, you have the capacity to record realistic, right, photographic images onto a semi-flexible substance. It will be not until the 1890s that you have the celluloid film stock, right, that is really critical to be able to print those things onto a substance that can be passed through a projector. Okay. Now, other key figures here include more scientists. Étienne-Jules Marchais, who's another Frenchman who's interested in the movements of animals and human bodies. Right? And he creates, first, a system in which he can record lots of images onto a single glass plate. And so this is what you get here. He would set up his camera in front of a black background, right? And he would have, for instance, in this case, a bird fly across the background, and he would record lots of images all onto a single plate. Right? So you get the kind of idea of movement. So you can study the different shapes, the different formations of the bird's wings, or how the horse moves, or how a human jumps up and down. He did lots of things. Here's another example where he tried to create the sensation of motion, or try to kind of somehow capture motion by moving the slide, right, during the recording. And that's why you get these blurred images. This is his assistant, Georges Demeny, playing the violin. Okay, so this is what Marchais is doing. Another, not quite so scientific, quite a scientist, Edward Muybridge, who's a photographer. Muybridge had a similar idea of trying to record motion, and he's very famous for taking these photos of the horse galloping, the horse trotting actually, not galloping, the horse trotting. Does anyone know the story of Muybridge and the horse? What's the story of Muybridge and the horse?
There was a net, he had feet come off the ground and it was running, and so he set up this way to actually capture a horse running in order to prove a point.
Okay, right, so the story is Leland Stanford, who was the governor of the state of California, and whose name was given to Stanford University. Leland Stanford wanted to know, did all of the horse's feet come off the ground at the same time during a trot? Right? And so they hired Muybridge, who said, I can prove it. And what Muybridge did was he set up a battery of cameras and tripwires, and as the horse went by, it would trip the wire, and it would open the lens, and it would take a photo. Right? And if you put these photos, right, in sequence, right, then you could see, right, where all 4 feet are off the ground at the same time. But what Muybridge figured out was that it was also a really entertaining device, and he could put these onto a disc, right, the phenakistoscope, and you could recreate the running of the horse. Right? Not so useful actually for telling if the feet are off the ground, right? You need the photo for that, right? But the recreation of it appealed to people, right? This is almost cinema, right? So he develops this device called a praxiscope, right? And what he would do is he would print his photos, right? And first he tried to print them and put them around this disc, right? Like those other devices we'd seen. He'd turn the disc, and you would see the horse projected running. Well, it turned out that it looked really weird, like it just didn't work, right, optically. And so instead he would manipulate the horses on the discs. They're like slightly elongated. They're no longer really accurate representations of the horse, but it looked better when projected on the screen. Right? There's something about how it was rendered in rotation, right? And you end up with this. Right? This looks like cinema. Here we're getting quite close. He did this with he did this with other kinds of things, birds, humans. Are these for science? Not really. Okay. Now, at the same time, and here we're getting to what we think of as cinema. Thomas Edison, who some people call the inventor of cinema, is paying his assistant, W.K.L. Dixon, William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, to work on a device that's going to be known as the kinetoscope, and the camera is called the kinetograph. The kinetoscope is a peephole device in which you run this flexible material, celluloid, right, with images photoed onto it, right, through this device. The motor comes on, it moves automatically. You can look through the peephole, right, as this guy's doing, and you can see something like those Muybridge images, right? You can see something like this. Right? They're short, because you only have so much film you can fit in there. And they start to create scenes for that. This is in the 1880s, early 1890s, before the invention of cinema. They set up parlors where you could go and you could pay, and you put a nickel into the slot, and you could watch these animated scenes. Right? This is essentially film, it's just not projected onto a screen. Right? Because Edison couldn't figure out how to do it. Then you get the Lumieres, right? Now here we are, we're going to get to 1895. And the Lumieres developed this device called the cinematograph. And the cinematograph is a great device, in part because it will both record and project back the images. So the Lumieres solved the problem that Edison can't solve, which is how to get these moving images, moving photographs onto a screen. It's a hand-cranked device. It's just basically a box. And this device, which we won't go into in great detail because we don't have time, will project the images onto a screen. It will also record them. Right? So that film of the workers leaving the Lumiere factory that we saw before, captured with this device, playback with the same device. Okay? Meanwhile, so 1895, you get that. Meanwhile, Edison working on. Edison managed to buy a similar device invented by two American inventors, Charles Francis Jenkins and Thomas Armat, who developed a system, again, of projecting images onto a screen. And Edison buys this from them and renames it the Vitascope. He calls it his greatest marvel, but he actually had absolutely nothing to do with it. That's the power of Edison, who was a very rich and famous inventor. Right? And this debuts in New York on April 23rd, 1896. Right? So after the Lumieres. Okay. So by 1896, right, we have all of the devices. Right? We have all the things that we need. Now, any questions about that? Are stories. So the question's about Émile Plénaud, the Frenchman who paints stories. Stories, yeah, they're already stories. Okay? So some people, right, Plénaud catches on to the idea that you can tell stories with this device. Other people aren't so concerned with telling stories, although what we want to do is kind of think, oh, what is a story? Right? What counts as a story? Is the workers leaving the factory a story? It's an event, right? It's something that happens. It kind of has a beginning, middle, and end. If you kind of watch it again on your own carefully, you'll see that the workers start to come out of the factory, and at the end they close the doors and it's over. Right? That's kind of a story. But storytelling is not necessarily the principal idea. Right? And this is going to be the next point that I'm going to start to say a little bit about now, and then we'll say more about tomorrow before we watch a lot more films like this. The question we want to have then, if that's what it took to have cinema, right, the development of all those different kinds of technologies, for scientific reasons, for educational reasons, right, for religious reasons, what happened after this device gets developed? And here you're reading an essay by Tom Gunning, who's one of the most famous film scholars. He teaches at the University of Chicago. This is him here on the right, or at least part of him. And the essay you're reading is by him. It's about, it's called The Temporality of the Cinema of Attractions. Now I give it to you because it's a really kind of quick condensation distillation of the idea of the cinema of attractions, which was actually developed earlier in an earlier essay that you should read too on your own, which is called the Cinema of Attractions. And this was an idea that he developed with this other guy, André Gaudreau, who's a Canadian who teaches in Montreal. So Gunning and Gaudreau were part of an early generation or kind of a new generation of film historians working in the late 70s and the early 80s who really changed how we understood this period of cinema that we're studying this week. So what is the cinema of attractions? Well, you're going to read the essay and you'll find out. But essentially, Gunning and Gaudreau developed this idea as part of an effort to try to write better histories of cinema's early years. And here we return to one of the three big takeaway points for the week, and that is the idea that early cinema was not primitive. The first films were not poor versions of what came later. And this is essentially their point. Okay? Gunning makes the really important point in the article you're reading that historical assumptions tend to create barriers to understanding. Right? Here's where we run into the problem of the fact that the present, right, in your own present circumstances, affect how you understand the past. Right? It can create a barrier to actually understanding the past, and this is Gunning's point. So in other words, we have to really be careful about our preconceptions of what the past was because they can lead us to develop false impressions, and early cinema is a critical case of this problem. And here's what Gunning and Gaudreau, among others, argued at the time. Right? They looked at old histories of early cinema. They read all these old books about early cinema written by, presumably smart historians who had looked at them too, looked at these old films and wrote stories about them. And Gunning and Gaudreau went back and they read these stories and they were like, these are wrong. Right? This is bad history. Okay? And the reason it was bad is because those old historians had always tried to understand these first films simply as poor versions of what came later. Right? They looked at those old films and they were like, this isn't film, right? This isn't what film was going to be. Right? This is like before they had figured it out. Right? That's the way history had been written for decades and decades and decades. So people who just looked at the old films and they were like, well, eventually they got it right. Right? And Gunning and Gaudreau said, no. Right? The first film historians had watched these old films and they thought they were bad. And Gunning and Gaudreau said something else. Okay? We're going to have to stop for today, but tomorrow we're going to watch these films, and I'm going to be here, we'll watch them together, and I'll introduce them to you, and we'll kind of work through how Gunning and Gaudreau reconceptualized how we should understand them. Okay?